Hello and welcome to my channel. Today I'm going to provide a tutorial of how I painted this lake using watercolor. Follow along at home and let me know how it goes. To start, let's look at our reference photo. When I'm working on watercolor landscapes, I generally paint from top to bottom and from the items that are most distant to the items that are closest to the viewer. This means that our rough outline will be to start with the sky, then paint the mountains, then paint the water, and lastly paint the trees on the left side of the painting and their reflection. Let's also talk about color. We're going to use 5 paint colors for this painting: cerulean, which is the light blue, French ultramarine, which is the dark blue, burnt umber, which is brown, aureolin, which is yellow, and a little bit of alizarin crimson, which is a reddish pink. The goal is not to get an exact color match with the photo, but rather to use the photo and our selected palette to create a harmonious scene. You'll also need masking fluid for a few places where we'll want to protect the white parts of the paper. As a reminder, always use an old or junky brush when applying masking fluid so you don't ruin a good watercolor brush. First, I drew the scene. I used a marker in this example so the lines are visible for you to copy, but for the actual painting I used pencil. Then I mixed the colors for the sky. I mixed 3 different colors. The first is a light blue that's mostly cerulean with a little French ultramarine. This will be used for the sky. Then I mixed a darker color for the clouds, starting with cerulean and adding in a little more French ultramarine and a bit of burnt umber. Finally, I mixed a lighter cloud color. This is similar to the first color since it's a light mix of cerulean and a little French ultramarine, but I added some burnt umber to make it more gray. As a tip, you can lighten your colors if you add a little bit of water, and your colors will be darker if you use less water, but just keep in mind that you'll be painting the sky wet onto wet, so you don't want to add too much water because there will be some water on the paper as you're painting. The exact concentration of each color will vary also according to paint brand and the amount of water that you're using, so I can't give a precise percentage for how much of each color to add for your mixes, but hopefully you can use these color swatches as a guide. One of my tips for watercolor landscape paintings is to always paint the sky in a single layer. Once you start layering the sky, you will get hard edges that will make your clouds look unnatural. So to start, I wet the entire sky area. I want it to be completely wet, but I don't want to create any visible puddles on the paper. Looking at our reference photo, we can see that the sky is pretty light overall, and there are sort of diagonal stripes of clouds going across the sky. I'm going to start painting these cloud stripes with my light blue-gray color. Toward the bottom of the sky, I'm going to use some sky blue to paint the actual sky. Then I'm going to use my darker cloud color to add pigment where I need to darken the cloud stripes. Using a damp brush, I can blend everything together. Then I stop and I leave it alone. Like I said, it's best to do the sky in one wash and mess with it as little as possible to get the most natural looking results, so trust the process here. Once the sky is dry, it's time to paint the mountains. However, before I started painting the mountains, I applied masking fluid to the trees and bushes that touch the mountains so that I don't accidentally paint over those areas while I'm working on the mountains. After the masking fluid is fully dry, I can start painting the mountains. We'll start with the most distant one, which is a blue color. In general, objects in the distance tend to be cooler in temperature and more blue. As we get closer to the viewer, things become warmer in temperature and include more yellow and red. I mixed 3 more colors for the mountains. These are similar to the sky colors, but we're starting to introduce a little bit of yellow in here because, like I said, we're warming up a bit, especially for the mountain on the right, which is closer to us as the viewer of the scene. For this first mountain, I'm working wet on wet, concentrating a little more paint on the left side of the mountain since it's slightly closer to us and therefore it's darker. Once that's dry, I can paint the mountain on the right, which is closer to us and yet a little darker still and more green. I start by filling in the whole thing with my lighter color, and then I add detail with the darker color. I'm not worrying about including a lot of information, I'm just suggesting different topography and different trees here and there. Now it's time to paint the trees underneath this mountain. I mixed a gray-brown color for the shoreline from burnt umber and French ultramarine. I'm leaving a little strip of shoreline bare at the bottom of this section, and I'll come back and fill it in at the end. The tree colors are the same as the mountain colors, but with even more yellow this time. I hope this illustrates my point that our colors continue to get warmer as we come closer to the viewer, and we just keep adding more yellow and making things more green. The masking fluid helps us get this nice bumpy line here that's suggestive of treetops. Now I just have to fill it in and add darker bits of paint here and there to indicate individual trees. Again, we're not using a lot of detail, we're just suggesting information. Now it's time to paint the water, which we're going to do in 3 layers. First we'll paint the reflection of the sky since it's lightest. Then we'll paint the reflection of the mountain on the right. We'll take a break to paint the trees and the grass on the left, and then at the end we'll come back to paint the reflection of those trees and grass. The main water area has 3 colors that are a sort of blue, gray, green shade. They're pretty heavy on cerulean and aureolin, which is the yellow. To get the darker hues, I added a little bit more French ultramarine and burnt umber to the mix. I start by wetting the entire water area and painting it with the lightest watercolor. Then I start adding some waves and darker colors to that area that's closest to the viewer, allowing the dampness of the paper to soften the lines that I'm painting. To paint the reflections of the mountains, I use the same colors that I originally used to paint the mountains. So I'm starting with the blue mountain and using some of that blue to paint its reflection. You can see that I use horizontal brush strokes to indicate little waves and ripples, varying their length and value. Now it's time to paint the reflection of the closer mountain. Once again, I'm using the same colors as I used to paint the actual mountain. I wet the area but left some parts around the edges dry so that I can paint ripples in the dry areas. I'm filling in the area with the blue of the mountains and then filling in this darker part that's reflecting the trees. I don't need to worry about exactly matching the reflection to the image above, I'm just approximating and letting the paint and water blend together on their own. Now it's time to paint these trees on the left. Before we can paint the reflection of the trees in the water, we need to actually paint the trees first so we know what we're looking at and reflecting. Building on our approach to color, we're adding more aureolin to these green mixes, and we're also using just a hint of alizarin crimson in these greens to give them a realistic hue. To paint evergreen trees like this, I generally use a clean brush to quickly wet the areas where I've marked the trees in pencil. If you paint the trees on the paper dry, it will sometimes look unnatural, and the water helps soften everything. You can see that I've used masking fluid to protect the top of the grasses while I'm working on these darker trees. I'm filling in the area with the lightest green first and then painting some of the trees with the medium green. Then I'll come back and add details with the darkest color last. Now it's time for the bushes and grasses below the trees. These are my brightest and warmest colors of the piece, using a lot of aureolin, a bit of alizarin crimson, and some burnt umber to create warmth. I removed the masking fluid, wet the area, and started filling it in with these brighter greens. I used some of the darker paint from the trees above to create little details here and there within the foliage. Finally, it's time to paint the reflection of the trees. To do so, I'm using the same colors that I used for the trees and bushes. I wet the area, fill in the reflection of the grass first since it's lightest, and then start painting the darker reflections of the trees using those same horizontal brush strokes. Last but not least, I used some very light burnt umber and French ultramarine to paint the shoreline. And that's the finished painting. Let me know how it went if you followed along, and as always, thanks for watching and happy painting!